The house looked ordinary from the street. Beige siding, 2 cars in the driveway, porch light usually left on like a habit. Nobody questioned. Inside, 7 lives moved in overlapping routines. Coffee before dawn, shoes by the door, a TV murmuring late into the night. Nothing loud, nothing unusual. Then one morning, the sound stopped. No slammed doors, no engines, no lights flicking on. Sunday arrived like it always did, but the family didn't. Calls rang out into silence. The locked door opened easily. Mugs sat unwashed. Clothes were laid out. Wallets and keys were still there. Beds waited untouched. And somewhere between midnight and sunrise, 7 people vanished without leaving a single step behind. In the spring of that year, the house was never truly quiet, even when the sun dipped behind a low tree line, and the road outside felt empty. Something inside the walls stayed awake. A television murmured long after midnight. Floorboard sighed under careful footsteps. A porch light burned faithfully, not as a warning, but as a habit, an unconscious promise that someone was always home. It was the kind of house people passed without looking twice. Beige siding softened by years of wind. A roof that had known better decades. A narrow driveway where 2 cars rested side by side like tired animals. Nothing about it suggested significance. And yet, for those who knew it, the place had a pulse. 7 people lived there, bound not only by blood, but by routine. 3 generations under one roof, each orbiting the others in a way that felt messy and imperfect and human. Mornings began early. Coffee brewed before the sky had fully decided what color it would be. Someone always forgot their keys. Someone always complained about the weather. A radio in the kitchen favored the same local station every day, its volume adjusted by muscle memory rather than thought. They were not an extraordinary family. That was the point. No one remembered them because they were loud or wealthy or controversial. They were remembered because they were steady, predictable, the kind of people who showed up when they said they would, the kind who waved back even when tired. Neighbors would later say they were private, but not distant. There were nods across lawns, short conversations about mail, about gas prices, about how quickly the kids were growing. Nothing confessional, nothing suspicious, just the soft acknowledgement of shared space. Inside the house, life layered itself in overlapping rhythms. The older generation moved more slowly, favoring familiar chairs and familiar views from familiar windows. They spoke less, but noticed more. They tracked time not by calendars, but by aches, by news cycles, by the changing taste of the tap water as seasons shifted. The adults in the middle carried the weight. Jobs that paid enough, but never quite enough. Bills stacked neatly in a drawer that was opened and closed with increasing care. Conversations that lowered in volume when children entered the room. Disagreements that never erupted, but never fully resolved either. There was tension there, but not the dramatic kind people imagine when they hear the word later. It was quieter, heavier, the kind that settles into the body rather than exploding outward. The children filled the rest of the space with sound. Shoes kicked off too close to the door. Backpacks dropped wherever gravity decided. Laughter that rose suddenly and died just as fast. Arguments over television channels. Complaints about dinner followed by empty plates. The ordinary chaos that marks a house is alive. Evenings were the loudest. Everyone seemed to converge at once. Schedules overlapping just enough to create friction. Someone cooked while someone else hovered. Homework spread across the table. News played in the background, half listened to, its grim stories muted by the comfort of togetherness. Sometimes voices sharpened. Sometimes someone left the room, but they always came back. There were signs in hindsight that something was off. Not alarms, not red flags, just small misalignments. A bill paid later than usual. A missed appointment that required an apology. A phone call taken outside. The door closing a little too carefully behind it. Moments that registered as nothing at the time, because life is full of moments like that. On one evening not long before everything ended, a neighbor noticed raised voices through an open window. Nothing violent, nothing unusual, just the sound of people trying to explain themselves and failing. The porch light still came on that night. The television still glowed blue against the curtains. The house, from the outside, looked the same as it always had. What no one could see were the decisions being weighed quietly, the thoughts that circled without finding words, the unspoken understanding that whatever was pressing on them was not something easily shared. Families often keep their most important conversations contained within their walls, not out of secrecy, but out of instinct. This one was no different. They went to bed that night in their usual places, doors half open, lights left on in rooms no one occupied, a sink left with dishes soaking, as if someone planned to return in a few minutes, clothes laid out for the next day, alarm set, the future assumed. If there was fear, it did not announce itself. It did not scream or break or run. It sat quietly, wearing the disguise of normal exhaustion. If there was a plan, it was not written down. If there was an ending approaching, it did not knock. The next morning was supposed to arrive like all the others. Someone was supposed to complain about waking up too early. Someone was supposed to burn the toast. Someone was supposed to rush back inside for something forgotten. The house was built on the assumption of continuity. But that morning never quite began. At some point before dawn, the lights went out earlier than usual. The television went dark mid-sentence. The hum of activity that had always carried through the walls simply stopped. No one on the street noticed. No car door slammed. No engine turned over. The porch light did not switch back on. By the time the sun rose, the house looked the same. That was the most dangerous part. Curtains drawn, cars unmoved, doors locked. It looked like a family still asleep, still inside, still breathing in unison. Only later would anyone understand that what had disappeared first was not 7 people, but the sound of them. Sunday morning arrived without urgency. The sky was pale, washed in by clouds that couldn't decide whether to stay or drift apart. It was a kind of morning built for routine, predictable, almost forgiving. The town moved at its usual pace. Lawns waited to be mowed. Church bells prepared to ring. Coffee brewed in dozens of kitchens, steam rising into familiar kitchens where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen, except in one house. By mid-morning, the first absence went unnoticed. A missed appearance at church was not unusual on its own. Families slept in. Children complained of headaches. Someone worked a late shift the night before. Absence had plausible explanations, and this town was generous with them. People assumed the family was running late. Or maybe they decided to skip that week. No one felt alarmed yet. Alarm requires comparison, and there was nothing to compare this to. Not yet. The second absence landed harder. A call went unanswered. Then another. A mother waiting for her daughter to arrive for a birthday lunch checked the clock again. Irritation rising before worry had time to catch up. She tried the house phone. It rang until it stopped. She tried a cell number. Voicemail. She told herself the signal must be bad. She told herself she'd try again later. By noon, concern began to collect, slow and sticky. A supervisor at work noticed a no-show. Then another. 2 people missing from 2 different places on the same morning. Still, coincidence held its ground. Emergencies happened. Families had emergencies together. It wasn't impossible. It was just unlikely. When someone finally drove past the house deliberately, slowly, the details began to feel wrong. Both cars were still in the driveway, not angled hurriedly, not half-parked, just resting there as they always did. The porch light was off, though it was still early enough that someone might have turned it back on out of habit. The curtains were drawn the same way they had been the night before. Nothing was visibly disturbed. The knock on the door was gentle at first. A neighbor's knuckles touched the wood with the soft confidence of someone expecting an answer. When none came, the knock sharpened slightly, edged with embarrassment. Still nothing. The house did not respond the way houses usually do. No footsteps. No voice calling out. No movement behind the glass. Phones were tried again. Messages left. Names spoken into quiet receivers, suddenly sounding too loud. The silence on the other end felt active, as if it were choosing not to answer rather than simply failing to do so. By early afternoon, the word missing hovered unspoken between conversations. People circled it carefully, as if saying it aloud might summon something worse. A family member tried the door next. It was locked, not jammed, not forced, just locked, the way it always was. The call to law enforcement was measured, calm, apologetic, even. The caller emphasized they didn't want to overreact. 7 people were unaccounted for, but no one wanted to sound dramatic about it. The dispatcher asked routine questions, and the answers came back neatly wrong. When were they last seen? The night before. Were there any signs of distress? No. Any recent travel plans? Not that anyone knew of. Had they taken vehicles? The vehicles were still there. An officer arrived, then another. They walked the perimeter, looked through windows without pressing too close. They noticed what everyone noticed. Everything looked normal, too normal, the kind of normal that relies on human presence to make sense. Without people inside it, the house felt staged, like a set waiting for actors who had missed their cue. The decision to enter the house was not immediate. There are rules about these things, rights, protocols. Even worry has procedures it must follow. When permission was finally given, the door opened easily. No resistance, no hesitation. The lock worked exactly as it should. Inside, the air felt untouched. Not stale, not heavy, just still. The smell of coffee lingered faintly, as if the morning had begun and then been abandoned halfway through. Shoes sat near the door. Jackets hung where they always hung. Nothing suggested urgency. Nothing suggested departure. The kitchen told the clearest story. A half-empty coffee pot. Mugs on the counter, not yet washed. A loaf of bread left open, the end piece drying out slowly. These were not the traces of people who planned to leave for days. These were the traces of people who planned to come back in minutes. Bedrooms were the same. Beds unmade, but not slept in deeply. Clothes laid out with intention. Medications left behind. Wallets on dressers. Purses where they were usually kept. If the family had chosen to leave, they had chosen to leave without the things people take when they expect the world to continue. There were no notes, no explanations, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet residue of interrupted life. Outside, word spread faster now. Curiosity gathered in small clusters at the edges of driveways. People whispered not because they had secrets, but because the situation demanded reverence. 7 people do not vanish together without pulling something loose in the collective mind. It makes everyone review their own assumptions about safety, about proximity, about how quickly the ground can shift. Law enforcement remained cautious. Voluntary disappearance was mentioned. Family disputes. Unannounced trips. Even as the explanations were spoken, they sounded thin. 7 people. 3 generations. No vehicles. No money. No witnesses. Each detail added weight, pressing down on the most reasonable theories until they bent under the strain. As evening approached, the sense of wrongness deepened. Lights in nearby houses flicked on one by one. Dinner was cooked. Children were called inside. Normal life continued around the empty house, making its stillness feel louder by comparison. The porch light did not come on. No one arrived late. No car pulled into the driveway apologetically. When night fell, the house sat dark, absorbing the absence fully now. It was no longer just quiet. It was hollow. By the end of the day, there was no longer any doubt about the scale of what had happened. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a delayed return. This was 7 people gone without transition, without explanation, leaving behind a Sunday that never reached its afternoon. And somewhere in that silence, something settled in, a realization that whatever had happened did not need violence or chaos to be terrifying. It had relied instead on the simplest, most unsettling act of all, stopping. By the time the investigation shifted from concerned procedure, the house had already begun to change, not physically, but in how it was seen. It was no longer a home. It was a container. Every room became a question mark. Every object a potential answer that refused to speak. The first full sweep happened under fluorescent light and quiet voices. Officers moved carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the uncertainty pressing in on them. They photographed everything. Door frames, window locks, corners where dust gathered undisturbed. They noted what was present with the same seriousness. They noted what was missing. There were no footprints in the yard. The ground, still firm from the cool nights of early spring, held nothing but the faint impressions of days-old movement. No drag marks. No cluster impressions suggesting urgency or struggle. If 7 people had left together, they had done so lightly or long enough ago that the earth had already decided to forget. Inside, the air carried no chemical sharpness, no metallic hint that might suggest violence. Just a neutral smell of lived-in space. Cleaning products, old wood, fabric warmed by years of bodies. Investigators had seen houses that screamed what had happened the moment you crossed the threshold. This one whispered nothing. They moved room by room, documenting with practiced attachment. The living room offered no answers. Cushions slightly askew, the result of habit rather than disruption. A remote control resting on the arm of the couch, positioned as if someone had set it down mid-thought. The television screen bore a faint smear, likely from a child's hand. Unnoticed at the time, impossible to ignore now. The kitchen was examined next, its surfaces telling the same incomplete story. Cups with dried rings at the bottom. A cutting board left out. No spoiled food. No packed bags. No sign that meals had been prepared in advance or abandoned in panic. The refrigerator held groceries bought for the coming week. Milk that would expire in a few days. Leftovers labeled with dates. Evidence of planning that assumed tomorrow would arrive. Investigators are trained to look for contradictions. In this house, consistency was a problem. Everything matched the story of an ordinary night, followed by an ordinary morning that never happened. Bedrooms deep in confusion. Each space reflected its occupant clearly, too clearly. Clothes arranged for the day ahead. School materials stacked neatly. Alarm clocks set, some still blinking quietly, waiting for hands that never reached them. Medications, critical ones, left behind. No parent would willingly leave those. No child would forget them all at once. Wallets were cataloged. Identification cards. Cash amounts small but present. Purses hung on hooks by the door. Straps curved in familiar shapes. Keys rested in their usual places. The absence of these items would have suggested intention. Their presence suggested interruption. Bathrooms offered nothing more than mundane detail. Toothbrushes damp from recent use. Towels folded or tossed casually, depending on the person who owned them. No water running. No overflowing sink. No sign of a hurried exit. The house had not been abandoned mid-crisis. It had been paused. Outside, the cars became their own puzzle. Both vehicles were operational. Fuel tanks partially full. No luggage inside. No personal items that suggested travel. They were parked neatly, as they always were, angled just enough to avoid blocking one another. If the family had left together, they had not done so in the most obvious way available. Canvassing the neighborhood yielded little. No one had heard shouting. No one had seen unfamiliar vehicles. No one remembered anything unusual beyond the absence itself. People strained to recall sounds, movements, moments they might have dismissed at the time. Memory bent under the pressure, offering possibilities rather than facts. Investigators traced phone records. The last outgoing calls were unremarkable. Routine. No flurry of contact. No goodbye messages. Incoming calls went unanswered after a certain point, the silence beginning abruptly rather than gradually. It was as if someone had turned a switch. There was no ransom demand, no message left with intent, no indication that anyone outside the family expected something to happen. The disappearance did not announce itself to the world. It simply occurred. As hours turned into days, the language around the case shifted. Words like voluntary and domestic entered conversations, not because they fit, but because something had to fill the void left by the lack of evidence. Investigators considered the possibility of a planned departure, but the theory collapsed under its own weight. 7 people do not leave without money, transportation, or trace. They do not leave medications behind. They do not leave without telling anyone, not all at once. The absence of struggle was perhaps the most disturbing element. No broken furniture. No overturned chairs. No damaged locks. If force had been used, it had left no signature. If persuasion had been involved, it had been absolute. One investigator stood for a long time in the hallway, looking at the open doors lining both sides. Bedrooms, bathroom, storage closet, all accessible, all empty. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to resume. Files were opened, names entered into systems, descriptions circulated, photographs copied and distributed. The family was transformed into data points, their faces flattened into pixels and ink. Height, weight, hair color, last seen wearing. The details felt inadequate, like trying to describe a song using only numbers. Search teams expanded outward. Woods, nearby roads, waterways. Nothing surfaced. No clothing, no personal effects, no signs that anyone had passed through those spaces recently. Each negative result tightened the knot rather than loosening it. In cases like this, investigators often cling to anomalies. Anything that breaks pattern becomes a lifeline. Here, there were none. The case offered no sharp edges to grab onto, just smooth surfaces that reflected confusion back at anyone who studied them too long. As the days stretched beyond their expected shape, the town began to change in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. At first, the disappearance had been treated like a shared worry, something spoken about in low voices and careful phrases. But uncertainty has a way of demanding attention, and when answers failed to arrive, people began to fill the space themselves. It started with questions that sounded reasonable. Had anyone noticed strange visitors in the weeks before? Did the family seem stressed? Were there arguments people hadn't taken seriously at the time? Each question invited speculation, and speculation, once welcomed, rarely leaves quietly. Coffee shops became unofficial briefing rooms. Conversations drifted toward the same subject regardless of where they began. Someone would lower their voice and lean in, as if volume alone could summon danger. Another would nod knowingly, offering a theory that sounded confident enough to feel true. The absence of facts made certainty seductive. One rumor suggested money troubles. A whisper claimed that the family owed more than they could pay, that someone had come to collect. The idea spread not because it was supported by evidence, but because it fit a familiar narrative. People understand debt. They understand desperation. It made the mystery feel smaller, more manageable. Another theory painted the disappearance as intentional, a fresh start, a secret plan carried out under cover of darkness. The family, in this version, became architects of their own vanishing. It was a comforting idea in its own way. If they had chosen this, then no harm had been done. No one had been taken. No one had suffered. They were simply elsewhere, beyond the reach of concern. More unsettling stories followed. Mentions of cults, of religious movements that preyed on close-knit families. Someone recalled a pamphlet left in a mailbox months earlier. Someone else claimed to have seen unfamiliar faces at a gas station. Details blurred together, fed by imagination and repetition until they acquired the weight of memory. With each retelling, the family grew less real. Their routines and habits were replaced by archetypes: the secretive patriarch, the anxious mother, the impressionable children. Complexity flattened into convenience. It was easier to discuss an idea than to sit with 7 distinct absences. Local media arrived, eager but cautious. Reporters stood at the edge of the driveway, careful not to step too far onto the property. Cameras trained on a house that refused to perform. They spoke of the mystery with measured tones, emphasizing concern while packaging the story neatly enough to move on when something newer appeared. For a brief moment, the town felt seen. Interview requests multiplied. Neighbors recounted small interactions, each hoping their memory might be the missing piece. But as days passed without development, attention drifted. The story lacked the elements that sustained interest. There was no suspect to point at, no dramatic evidence to unveil. Silence does not compete well with spectacle. As official updates slowed, unofficial narratives accelerated. Online forums picked up the thread, populated by strangers who analyzed from afar. They overlaid maps, constructed timelines, and argued with conviction. The distance allowed for boldness. Accusations were made without consequence. Sympathy became optional. Inside the town, relationships strained. People who had once spoken casually now measured their words. No one wanted to be the source of the next rumor. At the same time, no one wanted to appear ignorant. Knowing something, anything, became a form of social currency. Candlelight vigils were organized in the early weeks, their sincerity undeniable. People stood together in the evening air, flames trembling in their hands, faces soft with concern. Names were spoken aloud, each one a reminder that this was not an abstract puzzle, but a human loss. Yet even these gatherings changed over time. Attendance thinned. Conversations during the vigils grew longer than the moments of silence. Children in the neighborhood felt the shift without fully understanding it. They were warned to stay closer to home, to lock doors, to check in more often. The disappearance became a lesson in caution. Its details simplified and softened to fit parental narratives. Fear filtered down, reshaped into rules. The house itself became a focal point. Some avoided walking past it, as if proximity might invite the same fate. Others slowed deliberately, drawn by the gravity of unanswered questions. Curtains were scrutinized, shadows interpreted. The absence became a presence, heavy and watchful. What was most striking was how quickly compassion began to erode. Not out of cruelty, but fatigue. Living with unresolved tragedy requires emotional energy, and people have limits. The family's disappearance, once a shared burden, gradually became an inconvenience, a disruption to the town's sense of order. Blame began to surface, subtle at first. Why hadn't they told anyone if something was wrong? Why hadn't they asked for help? The questions implied responsibility, shifting weight away from the unknown and onto those who could no longer respond. It was easier to fault the missing than to accept vulnerability. Law enforcement felt the pressure as well. Each rumor demanded evaluation. Each tip required follow-up. Resources were finite, and leads led nowhere. The gap between public expectation and investigative reality widened, breeding quiet resentment on both sides. By the time weeks turned into months, the disappearance had settled into the town's identity, like an old scar. It was referenced casually, sometimes even jokingly, stripped of its original gravity. New families moved in. Children grew older. Life asserted itself, as it always does. And yet, beneath the routines and reassurances, something remained unsettled. The mystery had not been solved or forgotten. It had been absorbed, woven into the collective psyche as a reminder of how quickly certainty can fracture. The family was no longer just 7 people who were gone. They had become a mirror, reflecting the town's fears, biases, and need for explanation. Each theory said less about what had happened and more about who was speaking. In the end, the greatest transformation was not in the case itself, but in how people related to it. What began as shared concern fractured into competing stories, each one pushing the truth further away. And in that widening gap between fact and fiction, the family's real lives, messy, ordinary, human, were slowly replaced by something easier to talk about, but far harder to mourn. By the time the case was labeled cold, the word itself felt like an insult. Nothing about the disappearance felt distant or settled, yet the machinery of time moved forward with indifference. Files were boxed. Evidence was logged and archived. The house was secured, then eventually released. Officially, there were no new leads worth chasing. For most people involved, this marked an ending of sorts. Officers were reassigned. Supervisors shifted attention to cases with momentum, with visible progress. The absence of 7 people became something to be referenced rather than actively pursued. A line in a database, a file number that required periodic review, and nothing more. But for one investigator, closure never arrived. He had been on the case from the beginning, present during that first walk through the house when it still smelled faintly of coffee and unfinished mornings. He had felt the wrongness then, even if he hadn't had the language for it. When the case stalled, that feeling did not fade. It sharpened. He kept copies of the files long after he was required to. Not hidden exactly, but not advertised either. Photographs printed and reprinted, their edges softening with use. Witness statements read so many times the words began to lose meaning, leaving only tone behind. He noticed patterns not because they were obvious, but because he had nothing else left to look at. At night, he would spread materials across his kitchen table, the same way families spread homework and bills. His house grew quiet around him as the world outside continued on its schedule. He traced timelines with his finger, following the days up to the disappearance, then stopping at the same blank space every time. No matter how he approached it, the story ended too abruptly. What bothered him most was not what was missing, but what was too perfect. No forced entry. No financial panic. No frantic communication. It felt curated, though by whom he could not say. Cases born of chaos leave fingerprints. This one left symmetry. He began calling people again, years after their initial interviews. Some were surprised to hear from him. Others were irritated. Memories had dulled. Stories shifted slightly, shaped by retelling and distance. Still, he listened, not just for facts, but for hesitation, for the places where language slowed, where certainty thinned. He revisited the house when it was empty, standing in rooms that had been stripped of furniture and warmth. New paint covered old walls. Carpets had been replaced, but the layout remained. He walked the same path again and again, imagining the last moments before the silence. Nothing revealed itself, yet the space refused to let him go. Colleagues told him to let it rest. He had other responsibilities, other cases with victims who could still be helped. He understood the logic. He even tried to follow it. But the disappearance had lodged itself too deeply. It was not an open wound. It was a weight, constant and unseen. What kept him engaged was a detail so small it had been dismissed early on, a timing discrepancy, a neighbor's statement that didn't align perfectly with phone records. It was nothing anyone would build a case on, nothing that would survive scrutiny. And yet, it returned to him again and again, tapping softly at his thoughts. He circled in his notes, then crossed it out, then circled it again. The inconsistency didn't explain anything. It simply refused to disappear, much like the family themselves. In a case defined by absence, this sliver of imperfection felt important. As the years passed, the world moved into new rhythms. Technology changed. Systems updated. The case file aged, its paper yellowing, its digital record migrating through platforms. Each transfer risked loss, distortion. He ensured it didn't happen, updating entries himself, making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. He attended conferences and listened to other investigators describe their own unsolved cases. Patterns emerged across stories. Disappearances without violence. Families who vanished together. Cases quietly shelved not because they lacked significance, but because they defied structure. He began to wonder if the failure was not in the evidence, but in the framework used to interpret it. On quiet afternoons, he allowed himself to think about the family as people again, not subjects, not victims. He imagined the children grown now. If they were alive, he wondered who they might have become. These thoughts had no investigative value, but they anchored him to the humanity of the case. Without them, it would have been easier to let go. The detail he couldn't ignore finally led him to a box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were materials deemed irrelevant at the time. Minor reports, peripheral observations, things that hadn't fit anywhere else. He sifted through them slowly, methodically, not expecting revelation. Instead, he found a thread. It was not evidence in the dramatic sense. No confession, no location, just a reference. A name mentioned once, out of context, never followed up on because it didn't seem to connect to anything tangible. At the time, it had been dismissed as coincidence. Now, with years of perspective, it felt different. The name appeared again in another file, from a separate case, in a separate county. Similar circumstances, similar silence. The connection was thin, but it existed. He sat back, the realization settling in slowly. This was not a solution. It was not even a clear lead, but it was movement, the first in a long time. Proof that the case had not ended, that it had simply been waiting. He did not announce his discovery. He did not reopen the file officially. He knew better. Premature attention could collapse fragile threads. Instead, he began quietly gathering information, expanding outward rather than inward. If the disappearance was part of something larger, it would not reveal itself all at once. For the first time in years, the weight he carried shifted slightly. It did not lift, but it redistributed, making room for something else. Not hope, not yet, but purpose. The case remained cold on paper. Boxes stayed on shelves. But in the mind of one person who refused to accept the silence, it was alive again, waiting for the moment when its fragments might finally form a shape and demand to be seen. The deeper the past was examined, the more it resisted a single interpretation. When investigators began to look backward instead of outward, the story of the family shifted subtly, like an image brought into focus only to reveal new distortions. The months before the disappearance no longer felt neutral. They felt weighted, as if they had been carrying something quietly toward an edge no one could see at the time. Financial records were the first layer peeled back, not because they revealed disaster, but because they revealed restraint. Bills were paid late, but never ignored. Credit was used carefully, almost cautiously. There was pressure there, unmistakable, but also discipline. This was not a family spiraling out of control. It was a family managing stress in silence, choosing containment over confession. School records offered another angle. Teachers remembered nothing alarming at first. Attendance was consistent, grades stable. But buried among assignments was an essay written weeks before the disappearance, never flagged because it didn't break rules or cry for help. It described a house as a place where walls listened, a place where quiet mattered. At the time, it was read as metaphor. Now, it felt closer to observation. Phone records were revisited with more patience this time, not looking for volume, but for absence. Certain numbers stopped appearing entirely in the weeks before the vanishing, not gradually. Abruptly, conversations ended and were never resumed. No explanation, no conflict recorded, just silence where familiarity once existed. There was a voicemail, two, one that had been transcribed and dismissed as mundane. The voice was calm, almost cheerful, asking for a call back when convenient. But the timestamp placed it late at night, far outside the caller's usual pattern. The tone didn't match the hour. It sounded practiced, polite in a way that suggested performance rather than comfort. Personal journals told a similar story. No declarations, no plans outlined, just fragments, notes about schedules, reminders to pick things up, occasional lines that hinted at vigilance rather than fear. Phrases like, keep things inside, and don't talk about it here. At the time, these had been interpreted as references to ordinary family conflict. Now, they carried a different weight. The family's social world appeared to shrink in the final months. Invitations declined, visits postponed, explanations offered, but vague. They were not isolating completely, but they were narrowing their exposure, pulling inward without announcing it. It was a kind of behavior that rarely raises concern, because it looks like busyness, like exhaustion, like life. Extended relatives remembered small changes, things that hadn't seemed worth mentioning. A conversation cut short when someone entered the room. A child correcting an adult, reminding them not to say something out loud. A sense that certain topics had become off-limits without ever being defined. What emerged was not evidence of a plan to disappear, but evidence of awareness. The family seemed to understand that something existed beyond their control, something that required careful navigation. They were not running. They were adapting. This reframing unsettled investigators more than any dramatic revelation could have. Voluntary disappearance relied on intent. Abduction relied on force. What this suggested was neither. It suggested compliance without consent, preparation without escape. There were no goodbye letters because they didn't believe they were leaving forever. There were no packed bags because they didn't expect distance. Whatever they were responding to felt immediate, but not terminal. Temporary, perhaps. Manageable if handled correctly. The idea that they weren't taken in a traditional sense began to take shape. Not dragged, not threatened overtly, but guided, pressured through implication rather than violence. The absence of struggle suddenly made sense in a way that was deeply unsettling. Investigators considered the possibility that the family had been convinced to cooperate, that they believed leaving the house, briefly, calmly, was necessary to protect something or someone. The children's compliance suggested trust, not fear. trust in authority, trust in adults, trust that this interruption would resolve. There was no evidence of deceit within the family unit, no sign that one member had orchestrated the disappearance without the other's knowledge. If a decision had been made, it had been collective, or at least presented as such. What lingered most was a sense that the family had been trying to do the right thing, that whatever silence surrounded them in those final weeks was not born of guilt, but of caution. They were not hiding wrongdoing. They were protecting something fragile. The question shifted again, becoming more precise and more disturbing. Not what happened to them, but what had happened near them. What had they seen, heard, or stumbled into that required such careful restraint? And why had they believed compliance was safer than resistance? The timeline was reconstructed with this new lens, and patterns emerged that had previously been invisible. Minor schedule changes aligned with external events. A missed appointment coincided with a meeting no one could fully account for. A routine errand placed someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nothing on its own proved anything. Together, the fragments suggested proximity. The family had not been central to whatever unfolded. They had been adjacent. Witnesses without context. Participants without consent. This interpretation explained the most troubling aspect of the case. The lack of aftermath. No bodies. No ransom. No noise. If the family had been removed to contain information, there would be no incentive to publicize it. Silence would be the goal, not leverage. The realization reframed every earlier assumption. The disappearance was no longer an event. It was a response. A solution implemented quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. And yet, even within this darker understanding, there was no evidence that the family had been harmed immediately. Their belongings remained because they believed they would return. Their lives were left mid-sentence because they expected continuation. That expectation was what made the case unbearable. Somewhere between trust and obedience, the family had stepped into a space where their ordinary protections no longer applied. They had done what they thought was required, believing the system would eventually release them back into their lives. The fact that it never did was a final cruelty. As investigators closed their notebooks at the end of each long day, the question that haunted them was no longer whether the family had chosen to disappear. It was whether they had been given a choice at all. The case returned quietly, without ceremony or announcement. There was no press release, no renewed search effort that stirred the town from its routines. It resurfaced instead as a line item in a federal database, flagged not for its uniqueness, but for its resemblance to something else. Years had passed. The world had shifted in ways no one involved could have predicted back in that spring of waiting and silence. Technology advanced. Agencies reorganized. Jurisdictions blurred. What once felt isolated now existed within a much wider field of reference. And in that expanded view, the disappearance of one family no longer stood alone. It began with pattern recognition rather than evidence. Analysts reviewing unresolved cases noticed similarities that would have been invisible at a local level. Entire families disappearing together. No signs of forced entry. No financial motive that held up under scrutiny. No attempts at communication afterward. Cases that stalled quickly, not because of incompetence, but because they didn't behave like crimes were supposed to. These files were never meant to be read side by side. They lived in different states, different decades even, but when placed together, a quiet rhythm emerged. The same kinds of homes, the same absence of chaos, the same abrupt silence, following a short window of subtle behavioral change. The family from 1997 was pulled back into focus not because something new had happened, but because something else had. Another disappearance, years later, mirrored it too closely to ignore. Investigators unfamiliar with the earlier case began asking questions that local authorities had stopped asking long ago. When federal involvement deepens, it often does so invisibly. The goal is not disruption, but consolidation. Information is gathered, compared, sorted. Local departments are contacted carefully, sometimes without being told exactly why. The family's file was requested, reviewed, and cross-referenced, its content stripped of narrative and reduced of variables. What troubled federal analysts was not just the similarity of outcomes, but the similarity of precursors. In multiple cases, Families exhibited signs of heightened caution shortly before vanishing. Reduced communication, withdrawn social behavior, sudden adherence to routine, as if predictability itself offered protection. This was not the behavior of people preparing to flee, nor was it consistent with imminent danger. It suggested instruction, guidance, an external influence shaping decisions without leaving fingerprints. The case was quietly elevated, not officially reopened but reclassified. It moved into a category that rarely generated headlines and almost never generated closure, the kind reserved for matters considered sensitive not because of what they revealed, but because of what they touched. Federal agents approached the file differently. They were less interested in suspects and more interested in exposure. Who had the family interacted with in the weeks before their disappearance? What locations had they passed through incidentally? What events had occurred nearby that might not have involved them directly, but placed them within range? The answers were incomplete, but they began to suggest proximity to something larger, not criminal in the conventional sense, not something that resulted in immediate arrests or public reckoning, something administrative, operational, buried beneath layers of process and authority. This reframing shifted the tone of the investigation entirely. The question was no longer who took them, but who noticed them, who marked them as relevant, who decided that relevance carried risk. One of the most unsettling discoveries came from cross-agency notes that had never been shared with local law enforcement. Brief mentions of the family's address in unrelated reports. Not accusations, not investigations, just acknowledgments, as if the location itself had appeared on a map more than once. These references were not enough to build a case, but they were enough to justify silence. The kind of silence that protects systems rather than people. The family's disappearance, in this light, was not an anomaly. It was an outcome. Federal investigators understood the limits of their mandate, even if they believed the family had been removed to contain information, proving it would require exposing mechanisms that were not designed to be examined. The absence of violence worked against the case. There was no clear crime to prosecute, only an ethical void. Local authorities were not informed of the full scope of this reassessment. They were told only that the case was being reviewed in a broader context, that there were similarities elsewhere. No specifics, no confirmation, just enough to justify continued classification. Within the federal system, the family's file became one of many, not forgotten, but absorbed. Its details fed into models designed to predict risk, to identify point of intersection between civilians and operations never meant to involve them. What haunted those who reviewed it closely was how ordinary the family had been. They were not activists, not informants, not connected to anything that should have drawn attention. Their significance lay in their proximity, not their intent. The realization carried an uncomfortable implication. Safety was not just about behavior. It was about location, timing, being present when something else unfolded. In that sense, the family's disappearance was not targeted. It was incidental. There was no moment when a decision was signed authorizing their removal. No single actor who could be blamed. Responsibility diffused across procedures, assumptions, and risk assessments. The system did what systems do, minimize exposure. The case remained sealed under layers of classification that did not exist when the family first vanished. Requests for information were denied with language so vague it bordered on meaningless. There was nothing to appeal because nothing was officially acknowledged. Years later, when fragments of this reevaluation surfaced through quiet channels, they did not bring relief. They brought clarity of a colder kind. The family had not disappeared because no one cared. They had disappeared because someone cared too much about what they might know. And yet, even within this expanded understanding, the central question remained unanswered. Where had they been taken? How long had they been held? What became of them after their usefulness expired? Those questions lay beyond the reach of any database. The federal angle did not solve the mystery. It reframed it into something more unsettling than a crime. It suggested that the disappearance was not a failure of justice, but function of it, that the family had not fallen through the cracks, but been absorbed by them. And in that realization, the case acquired a permanence it had never had before. Not cold, not open, but suspended, held in a space where resolution was neither expected nor required, and where 7 ordinary lives remained classified, not as victims, but as variables that could never be returned. The discovery did not arrive with drama. There was no knock on a door, no sudden phone call that changed everything. It emerged the way uncomfortable truths often do, slowly, quietly, and almost by accident, buried beneath layers of things no one expected to matter. It began with routine audit, the kind designed to clean up old records rather than reopen old wounds. Digital systems were being updated, archives consolidated, thousands of files passed through hands that had no emotional connection to their contents. Most were glanced at once and forgotten immediately. This one lingered. What drew attention was not the family's disappearance itself, but a discrepancy in how their case had been logged across systems. In one database, the file ended where everyone believed it did. In another, it continued, thinly, sparingly, but unmistakably, a trail that should not have existed at all. The entries were brief, administrative in tone, no narrative, no conclusions, just timestamps and coded references that pointed away from the house, away from the town, away from everything local investigators had ever searched. It was as if the case had quietly changed hands without anyone being told. At first, analysts assumed error, a clerical mistake, a misfiled reference number. That happens more often than anyone likes to admit. But when the codes were cross-checked, they aligned with a category reserved for monitoring, not investigation. Observation rather than pursuit. This reframed everything. The family had not simply vanished and then been forgotten. For a period of time after their disappearance, someone had been watching, tracking movements, logging updates, waiting for something to resolve itself. What made the discovery so unsettling was the timing. The monitoring did not begin after the family vanished. It began before. Weeks earlier, subtle notations appeared. A location flagged. A household identifier entered and then re-entered, as if someone was unsure whether it belonged there. Nothing alarming on its own. Together, they suggested awareness. There was no record explaining why the family's address had been flagged. No description of an event that justified attention. Just a quiet acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, had decided the household intersected with something worth noting. The discovery forced investigators to confront a possibility they had previously avoided because it felt too speculative. The family had not been targeted for who they were, but for what they had unknowingly been near. Their disappearance was not reactive. It was preventative. Further digging revealed that the monitoring ended abruptly not long after the family vanished. The file went dormant. No follow-up, no resolution, just silence. Whatever concern had existed no longer required observation. The variable had been removed. This was the moment when disbelief hardened into something colder. Not shock, exactly. More like recognition. A sense that the absence of answers was itself an answer. The discovery did not point to violence. There were no references to detention, transport, or harm. But the lack of such details was not reassuring. It suggested that whatever happened to the family fell outside the scope of what needed to be documented. Investigators wrestled with what this meant. Monitoring implies caution, not hostility. It implies a desire to understand, to assess risk. If the family had been eliminated in the conventional sense, there would have been records, however classified. The absence of those records suggested a different outcome. The prevailing theory shifted again. The family had likely been approached. Not seized, not threatened overtly, approached with authority and reassurance. Given instructions framed as temporary and necessary, asked to cooperate for reasons presented as larger than themselves. This explained the calm, the lack of struggle, the belongings left behind. People who believe they are stepping away briefly do not pack for permanence. People who trust the source of instruction do not resist. What no one could determine was when that trust broke, if it ever did. The discovery raised ethical questions no one was prepared to answer. If the family had been removed to prevent exposure, what safeguards existed for their welfare? Were they relocated, detained, separated, or simply held until they were no longer relevant? The files offered no guidance. Whatever system had absorbed the family was not designed to account for them afterward. They were treated as a problem to be solved, not lives to be preserved. Those who reviewed the discovery understood immediately why it had remained hidden. It did not reveal a crime in the traditional sense. It revealed a mechanism, one that operated legally, quietly, and without accountability to the people it consumed. There was no villain to confront, no single decision to overturn, just a chain of small actions, each defensible on its own, that resulted in total erasure. The most haunting aspect was how easily it could have been anyone. The family had not sought attention. Silence, once understood as absence, began to reveal itself as something else entirely. It was not a failure to speak, but a decision not to. And decisions, unlike accidents, leave traces, not in what is said, but in what is carefully avoided. After the discovery reframed the disappearance, those closest to the case expected resistance, denial, pushback. What they encountered instead was something far more disorienting. Compliance. Doors did not slam shut. Calls were not returned with hostility. They were returned with politeness, so smooth it felt rehearsed. Language became abstract. Questions were acknowledged without being answered. Curiosity was met with patience, not transparency. Jurisdictional boundaries emerged as the first line of quiet defense. Local authorities were informed that certain aspects of the case now fell outside their scope, not because of wrongdoing on their part, but because the matter intersected with operations they were neither cleared for nor required to understand. It was framed as procedural, not personal. Paperwork followed, forms that redirected inquiries, memos that explained nothing while appearing thorough, the kind of documentation that creates the illusion of movement while ensuring nothing actually moves. Each request generated a response. Each response deferred responsibility elsewhere. What became clear was that no one entity owned the disappearance. It existed in the spaces between agencies, between mandates, between definitions. Crimes require perpetrators. This case had processes, and processes do not feel guilt. When extended family members attempted to press for answers, they encountered the same resistance dressed in softer language. They were thanked for their patience, assured that efforts were ongoing, encouraged to trust that if information could be shared, it would be. The implication was always the same. Silence was in their best interest. The phrase national interest appeared once, briefly, in correspondence that was later redacted. It explained everything and nothing at once. It elevated the disappearance beyond individual loss and placed it into a category where human cost is weighed against abstract risk. Once something enters that category, it rarely returns. What troubled observers most was not the secrecy itself, but its consistency. There were no leaks, no dissenting voices, no anonymous sources willing to whisper. The silence held, year after year, across administrations, across personnel changes. This was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of alignment. The system did not need to conspire. It only needed to agree not to look too closely. Within internal discussions, the family was no longer referred to by name. They were described as an exposure event, a liability vector. Language stripped them of narrative and replaced it with abstraction. This made the outcome easier to accept. You cannot grieve a vector. You can only mitigate it. Some investigators wrestled with the ethics quietly. They questioned whether containment had crossed into erasure, whether protection had become punishment. But these questions had no procedural home. There was no forum to submit them on, no committee tasked with moral review. The system rewarded resolution, not reflection. The absence of overt wrongdoing became the strongest shield. No evidence of violence meant no crime scene. No bodies meant no homicide. No ransom meant no kidnapping. Each missing element removed another avenue for accountability. The case existed in a legal gray zone where concern could be expressed, but action could not be compelled. This was why no one talked about it, not because they were forbidden to, but because there was nothing to say that could be acted upon. Language without consequence becomes dangerous to the speaker rather than the subject. Over time, the silence normalized. New personnel inherited the case as a closed matter, not solved but settled. Its presence in the system was maintained out of obligation rather than urgency. It was a file that taught by example. Some things are not meant to be resolved. The disappearance did not trigger reform or review. It did not prompt policy change. It was absorbed as acceptable loss. Its impact diffused across enough layers that no single person felt responsible for carrying it. Those who knew fragments of the truth learned quickly that knowing did not equate to power. Information without authority is a burden, not a tool. To speak would be to challenge a structure that had already decided the matter. Silence became not just safer, but rational. What haunted the case was not secrecy, but indifference, not the emotional kind, but the bureaucratic variety, the kind that emerges when human outcomes are evaluated through metrics designed to prioritize stability over justice. The family had not been punished. That was the prevailing internal logic. They had been managed, removed from a scenario deemed volatile. The fact that they never returned was framed as unfortunate rather than unacceptable, an outcome, not an error. Years passed. Time did what it always does when answers refuse to arrive. It moved forward anyway, slowly at first, then all at once, until the disappearance no longer felt recent but never quite felt past. The world adjusted its posture around the absence, learning how to live without expecting resolution. What was never recovered became the defining feature of the case. There were no remains to bury, no clothing discovered miles away, no final location to point to on a map. The absence left behind no physical anchor for grief. For the extended family, this was the hardest part. Mourning without an ending is not mourning at all. It is suspension. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed with chairs left empty, then eventually removed. At first, names were spoken carefully, as if saying them too loudly might shatter something fragile. Later, they were spoken less often, not because they mattered less, but because saying them hurt in ways that never dulled. There were no official declarations of death for years. Forms required certainty that did not exist. Insurance policies stalled. Estates remained unresolved. Lives were caught in administrative limbo, forced to wait for proof that could never be provided. The missing were not legally alive, but neither were they allowed to be dead. Photographs aged while the people in them did not. Children's faces froze in time, their expressions becoming eerily fixed as the world moved on around them. Each passing year widened the gap between who they were and who they might have become. Imagination filled the space where facts could not. For investigators, the lack of recovery was both relief and torment. Relief because no evidence of violence had surfaced. Torment because absence is the hardest condition to close. There was nothing to re-examine, nothing to exhume, nothing to test with new technology. The case did not evolve. It stagnated. Search areas were gradually deprioritized. Forests grew thicker. Construction reshaped landscapes. Roads expanded. Whatever traces might once have existed were absorbed by time and terrain. Even if something had been left behind, it was now buried beneath years of ordinary progress. The house, once the center of attention, changed hands. New owners repainted walls, replaced flooring, renovated rooms. Laughter returned, different voices, different rhythms. Children slept in bedrooms that once held unanswered questions. Life reclaimed the space with quiet insistence. Most people passing by no longer knew what had happened there. The story faded from common knowledge, surviving only in old conversations and occasional local references. To newcomers, it was just another house. To those who remembered, it was something else entirely. What remained unrecovered was not just physical evidence, but narrative closure. There was no final chapter to point to, no moment that explained everything that came before. The disappearance existed as an open loop, unresolved and resistant to interpretation. The extended family learned to live with uncertainty as a constant companion. Hope did not disappear, but it changed shape. It became quieter, less demanding, not an expectation of reunion, but a refusal to accept finality. As long as nothing was found, anything was possible. This possibility was both comfort and curse. It allowed imagination to wander into survival, into witness protection, into remote places where life continued unnoticed. It also prevented the kind of acceptance that allows grief to settle into something manageable. Every unknown preserved the wound. Years later, When questions were asked again by journalists or researchers, the answers sounded rehearsed, not because they were scripted, but because repetition had worn them smooth. The family story had been told so many times it had lost its edges, becoming something almost mythic. But myths usually offer meaning. This one offered only absence. The most haunting aspect was how complete the erasure had been. No financial activity, no confirmed sightings, no accidental encounters. The missing did not resurface in hospitals, shelters, or databases. It was as if they had stepped outside the world's accounting systems entirely. For some, this suggested intention. For others, it suggested something far darker. But without recovery, theories remained just that, shadows cast by incomplete information. The truth, whatever it was, left no residue. Even memory began to falter. Details blurred. Voices were forgotten. Specific habits dissolved into general impressions. The longer the absence stretched, the harder it became to recall the missing as real people rather than symbols of loss. And yet, certain things refused to fade. The knowledge that 7 people did not simply vanish on their own. The certainty that something had intervened. The quiet understanding that whatever happened had been thorough enough to leave nothing behind. This was the final cruelty of the case. Not just that the family disappeared, but that they left no physical proof of having been taken. No markers to insist that something wrong had occurred. Without recovery, outrage had nowhere to land. The story never offers the relief people expect from endings. It resists that instinct with quiet insistence, leaving behind not resolution but resonance. Long after the files are sealed and the house changes hands and the town forgets how it once held its breath, the disappearance continues to exist in a different way. Not as an active investigation, but as a question that refuses to be dismissed. What lingers is not the mystery where they went, but the unease of how easily they were allowed to go. 7 people vanished, and the world adjusted. Not violently, not dramatically. It adjusted the way systems are designed to adjust, by absorbing disruption and smoothing over the edges until normalcy could resume. Roads were repaved. Schools advanced their calendars. New cases took priority. The disappearance did not break anything important enough to stop momentum. That realization unsettles more than any imagined scenario ever could. Because somewhere in the layers of authority and procedure, the family's absence was weighed and measured, not emotionally, but operationally. Risk was assessed, exposure minimized, outcomes accepted. At no point did the system require certainty about their fate in order to move forward. It only required that the situation no longer pose a problem. The most haunting question the case leaves behind is not whether the family survived. It is whether survival was ever the point. People like to believe that truth has gravity, that if something terrible happens, it will eventually surface, pulled upward by its own weight. This story suggests otherwise. It suggests that truth can be contained, redirected, buried beneath enough layers of indifference that it never reaches daylight at all. There is no final villain to name, no dramatic confrontation waiting just beyond the horizon. The disappearance does not end with justice delayed or truth uncovered. It ends with acceptance, not the healthy kind, but the institutional kind, the kind that treats unresolved loss as an acceptable byproduct of maintaining order. This is what makes the case so difficult to let go of, not because it is unique, but because it isn't. The family was ordinary, their lives unremarkable by any metric that typically draws attention. They did not seek danger or significance. They were not reckless or rebellious. They lived within the boundaries they believed would keep them safe. And yet, they crossed an invisible line without ever knowing existed. That line is what remains after the story is told. The unsettling awareness that proximity alone can alter the trajectory of a life. That being present without intention, without action, can be enough to erase someone entirely. Somewhere, someone knows exactly what happened. That is a certainty that sits beneath all the speculation, not a collective someone, but an individual or a small group of individuals who were present when decisions were made, who saw names on a page and understood the consequences of moving forward anyway. They have lived their lives since then. They have attended meetings, raised families, retired, passed the responsibility along. For them, The disappearance was a moment, contained, concluded, archived. For everyone else, it became a void. The family does not return in the end. There is no reveal waiting in the shadows. The story closes the way it began, in quiet, with an absence that feels intentional, not accidental. And perhaps that is the final truth the case offers. Not that 7 people vanish without explanation, but that explanations exist which are never meant to be shared. That some losses are absorbed into systems so large they leave no room for accountability, only continuity. The question that remains is not meant to be answered easily. It lingers because it implicates more than one disappearance, more than one family. It asks what it means to live in a world where safety is conditional and where the price of stability can be paid by people who never consented to the transaction. The case ends not with closure, but with recognition. Recognition that mystery is not always a failure of knowledge. Sometimes it is a consequence of design. Recognition that silence does not always mean ignorance. Sometimes it means resolution has already occurred, just not for those left behind. 7 people went missing, and the world learned how to keep going without them. That is the part of the story no investigation can solve. Because the most unsettling possibility is not that the truth will one day be revealed. It is that it already was, to the only people who needed to know, and that everyone else was never meant to ask. Years later, when the story is told in fragments or remembered only in outlines, what remains is not the shock of disappearance, but the quiet adjustment that followed it. The way the world did not stop. The way it learned to accommodate the absence, as if absence itself were a natural condition. People often ask what happened next, expecting a sequence of events that leads somewhere definitive. But the truth is that nothing happened next in the way stories usually promise. There was no reckoning that arrived on schedule, no moment when the balance tipped back toward justice. There was only continuation. The town carried on, reshaped subtly by what it chose not to dwell on. Children who had once whispered about the house grew up and moved away. New families arrived with no knowledge of what had come before them. The disappearance became a local legend stripped of detail, a vague cautionary tale that lost its sharpness with every retelling. For those who remembered clearly, the weight never fully lifted. It changed form instead. It became something carried quietly, folded into daily life. A pause before answering questions about the past. A hesitation when discussing safety or trust, or how well anyone can really know what is happening just beyond their awareness. The extended family aged in a long shadow of uncertainty. Some clung to hope until it exhausted them. Others learned to set it aside, not because they believed the worst, but because constant hope can be a form of torment. Acceptance arrived unevenly, shaped by personality rather than truth. There was no moment when they stopped waiting. Waiting simply became less active, less visible. It turned inward, where it could coexist with ordinary routines without drawing attention to itself. Waiting became part of who they were. Every few years, a new inquiry would surface. A journalist revisiting old cases, a researcher tracing patterns. Each time, the questions reopened spaces that never truly closed. And each time, the answers fell short, constrained by the same silences that had shaped the case from beginning. The disappearance resisted ownership. No one could claim it fully, not investigators, not institutions, not storytellers. It lived in the margins, where responsibility thins and accountability dissolves. It belonged to no single narrative, and so it endured without resolution. What haunted those who studied the case was not just what was lost, but what was revealed about the world that absorbed that loss so efficiently. The systems that failed were not broken. They functioned exactly as designed. That was the most difficult truth to sit with. The family's lives did not end with scream or spectacle. They ended mid-motion, suspended between moments. That suspension became their legacy. Not tragedy in the traditional sense, but something quieter and more corrosive. The knowledge that erasure does not require violence to be complete. There is a temptation to look for meaning in such stories, to extract lessons or warnings that make the loss feel purposeful. But this disappearance resists that impulse. It offers no comfort, no moral clarity. It does not reward attention with insight. It simply exists, unresolved and indifferent to interpretation. And yet its impact persists. Because once you accept that 7 people can vanish without consequence, it becomes harder to believe in the guarantees you once took for granted. Safety feels conditional. Transparency feels performative. Justice feels selective. The case does not teach these lessons explicitly. It plants them quietly, where they take root over time. Somewhere, the people who made the decisions that shaped this outcome have lived full lives. They have experienced joy and loss unrelated to the family they once encountered as a problem to be managed. For them, the disappearance has likely faded into abstraction, if it remains at all. For everyone else, it lingers as a question without a destination. The story does not end with answers, because answers were never its purpose. It ends with awareness, the kind that settles slowly, long after the telling is done. Awareness that disappearance is not always an accident or a crime, but sometimes a function. Awareness that silence can be intentional, sustained, and effective. In the final accounting, the family is remembered not for how they lived or how they died, but for how completely they were removed from the narrative of the world. Their absence left no wound large enough to force change. It left only a trace, a faint outline where something once existed. And perhaps that is the most unsettling ending of all. Not that 7 people vanished, but that their disappearance fit so neatly into the structures around them that the world knew how to continue without needing to understand. That silence proved sufficient. The case fades here, not because it has been resolved, but because there is nowhere left for it to go. It remains behind, like an echo that never finds a surface to return from. 7 lives, erased without spectacle, a truth held by those who never speak, and a question that endures not because it demands an answer, but because it reveals how little the world requires one.